If the world hates you, know ye that it hated me before you. Those are the words of Jesus Christ on being hated by the world. It's a given that Catholics will be hated by the world. Have you ever noticed that when Christians are attacked by the enemies of Christ, it's almost always Catholics who are hated first? The Catholic imagery is what gets mocked by the world. The Black Mass is the perfect example of this. I've never heard of a demonic praise and worship service or a mock Lord's Supper, but we've all heard of Black Masses. And that's the point. While the world rejects the faith, it also affirms the faith through its persecution of the Catholic faith more than any other self-described Christian sect. And why is that? Because they can intuit that the Catholic faith is the real deal. Remember that as you move forward in life, dealing with the crisis in the church in your own way. I said this exact thing to an online celebrity who had for a time been affiliated with the alt-right before they converted to traditional Catholicism, and, as a consequence, were receiving hate and bile from across the ideological spectrum. I won't say who this person is, but please keep them in your prayers. Why am I starting this video on this topic? Because we have some news items that absolutely reflect the growing hatred of Catholicism by the world. It's become normal to hate Catholics. Soon it will be overtly encouraged. As evidence of this point, I present our story, which comes from the UK. It's so absurd that at first I thought I was reading it on the Babylon Bee and not on the Times of London. File this one under "The UK is not a serious country." The story goes like this. An Iranian woman converted from Islam to Christianity, citing that Christianity is a religion of peace. In her own words, quote, "In Islam there is violence, rage, and revenge. In Christianity, in the contrary, it is talking about peace, forgiveness, and kindness," end quote. In response, the UK's Home Office deployed its army of theologians to correct this poor, naive woman's take on Christianity. The officials used 6 passages from the King James Version and the New International Version of the Old and New Testaments, like Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, in which Christ proclaims he came not to send peace, but a sword, in an effort to prove that the Iranian woman's take of Christianity was wrong, and that Christian scripture is, in fact, quote, "filled with the imagery of revenge, destruction, death, and violence," end quote. The stooge at the Home Office went further in their rejection letter, stating, quote, "These examples are inconsistent with your claim that you converted to Christianity after discovering that it is a, quote, peaceful, quote, religion, as opposed to Islam, which contains violence, rage, and revenge," end quote, which may be the most passive-aggressive response to a convert I've seen in a while. This document is an implicit ruling that Christianity is not peaceful, certainly not relative to Islam, and indeed is so clearly not peaceful that the Home Office does not consider the peaceful nature of Christianity a credible reason for conversion. Consider that one for a while. But this isn't the first time we've seen the Home Office in the UK act in a horrifyingly anti-Catholic and anti-Christian manner. The following is a piece from the Gatestone Institute that details the UK's hostility towards Christian refugees from Syria. This is just one rather heinous example of many. UK, discrimination against Christian refugees. This is from the Gatestone Institute. It was published last August. Some bullet points here. The UN recommended 1,358 Syrian refugees for resettlement in Britain during the first quarter of 2018, of whom only 4 were Christians. Britain agreed to resettle 1,112 of these refugees, all of whom were Muslims, and refused to accept the Christians. Quote, "As last year's statistics more than amply demonstrate, this is not a statistical blip. It shows a pattern of discrimination that the government has a legal duty to take concrete steps to address," end quote, from Lord David Alton of Liverpool in his letter to UK Home Secretary Sajid Javid. What specific initiatives, other than empty words, does the UK government aim to take to rectify the damage that has already been done and to prevent it from happening again? Let's get to the main part of this story. The British government appears recently to have decided that it would like to give the impression that it cares about persecuted Christians. Prime Minister Theresa May said in Parliament on the 18th of July, quote, "As a government, we stand with persecuted Christians all over the world and will continue to support them. It's hard to comprehend that today we still see people being attacked and murdered because of their Christianity, but we must affirm our determination to stand up for the freedom of people of all religions and beliefs and for them to be able to practice their beliefs in peace and security. The British government even recently appointed its first special envoy on freedom of religion or belief with Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon, a former minister filling the post. According to the government, the role, quote, will promote the UK's firm stance on religious tolerance abroad, helping to tackle religious discrimination in countries where minority faith groups face persecution, end quote. Prime Minister May said she looked forward to supporting Lord Ahmad in this new role as he works with faith groups and governments across the world to raise understanding of religious persecution and what we can do to eliminate it. Perhaps the UK should not be so quick to preach to others when it does not appear to be doing much at home to help Syrian Christians who have been among the most persecuted for their faith since the civil war in Syria began 7 years ago. According to information obtained from the UK Home Office by the Barnabas Fund, the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, during the first quarter of 2018, recommended 1,358 Syrian refugees for resettlement in the UK, of which only 4 refugees were Christians. No Yazidis were recommended. The Home Office agreed to resettle 1,112 of these refugees, all of whom were Muslims, and refused to accept the Christians. This decision was made despite the fact that approximately 10% of the pre-2011 population of Syria was Christian, a number that has reportedly fallen to 5%. There were also an estimated 70,000 Yazidis in Syria. Yazidis, with Christians, were among the groups most viciously targeted by ISIS in Syria and Iraq. In 2017, moreover, according to the Barnabas Fund, the UNHCR recommended 7,060 Syrian refugees for resettlement in the UK, of whom only 25 were Christians and 7 were Yazidis. The Home Office ended up accepting 4,850 Syrian refugees, of whom only 11 were Christians. While the UK appears to favor Muslim refugees over Christian ones, the fault does not lie with the UK alone. Lord David Alton of Liverpool, a life peer in the House of Lords, wrote in a letter to Home Secretary Sajid Javid, quote, "There is widespread belief, justified or not, among the religious minorities of Syria that the UNHCR is biased against them. The UK has a legal obligation to ensure it does not turn a blind eye to either direct or indirect perceived discrimination by the United Nations. It is widely accepted that Christians, who constituted around 10% of Syria's pre-war population, were specifically targeted by jihadi rebels and continue to be at risk. As last year's statistics more than amply demonstrate, this is not a statistical blip. It shows a pattern of discrimination that the government has legal duty to take concrete steps to address." End quote. There certainly does appear to be a pattern of discrimination that has been ongoing since at least 2015. According to the Barnabas Fund, the UNHCR in 2016 recommended 7,499 refugees to the UK, of whom only 27 were Christians and 5 were Yazidis. In 2015, out of the 2,637 recommended refugees, 43 were Christians and 13 were Yazidis. In December 2016, Nina Shea, director for the Center for Religious Freedom of the Hudson Institute, asked the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees at the time, Antonio Guterres, to explain the disproportionately low number of Syrian Christians resettled abroad by the UN. Quote, "Mr. Guterres said that generally Syria's Christians should not be resettled because they are part of the DNA of the Middle East," end quote, writes Shea. Guterres' statement was a blunt admission of the UN's apparent disregard for Christian lives, not least because only 9 months earlier, in March 2016, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry had said, quote, "ISIS is responsible for genocide against groups in areas under its control, including Yazidis, Christians, and Shiite Muslims," end quote. The UN itself stated in September 2005, quote, "At the United Nations World Summit, all member states formally accept the responsibility of each state to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. That all member states had accepted, quote, the responsibility of each state to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. World leaders also agreed that when any state fails to meet that responsibility, all states, the international community, are responsible for helping to protect people threatened with such crimes." The apparent discrimination against Christians by the UK and the UNHCR is all the more disturbing in light of studies that find Christians to be the most persecuted faith in the world. Christians are, quote, the most widely targeted religious community suffering terrible persecution globally, end quote, according to a 2017 study by the University of Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture, the Religious Freedom Institute, and Georgetown University's Religious Freedom Research Project. In June, the 9th annual Pew Research Center report on global religious restrictions also found that Christianity was still the world's most persecuted faith, with Christians being harassed in more countries, 144, than any other group. If you want to read the rest of this lengthy article yourself, you can find a link to it on the Sources blog, which is linked in the description below. Like I said, the UK is not a serious country. Wait, maybe I'm wrong on that. The UK is a serious country, one that's seriously on its way to becoming a caliphate. What other reason could the British government have for explicitly barring Christian refugees from entering the country? A better question still is this: why does the UN openly discriminate against Christians? The answer is pretty much the same in both cases. The man at the Home Office who made the decision to not permit Christian entry into his country is a Mohammedan. The UN is also dominated by Mohammedans who tend to form a bloc to vote against Christian interests rather consistently. This shouldn't be surprising, given the history of the religion of peace and what happens when it opposes itself on Christian populations. For those who don't think that's coming to the UK, the numbers don't lie. The United Kingdom has birth rates so low that the words demographic collapse don't do how bad the situation is real justice. The UK has taken to importing people from high fertility rate countries with the strange belief that the culture of the UK will help culturally transform these so-called New Britons into being somehow British. They have discovered that hasn't exactly been the case, though, with the proliferation of no-go zones for non-Mohammedans across the country, as well as street violence, terrorism, and violent crime escalating. All that does play into why the UK has been hostile to Christian refugees while simultaneously speaking publicly in support of open borders and the so-called refugee crisis in Europe. Of course, none of this explains why the UK hates Christianity and Catholicism in particular. That can be explained by the rampant contracepting mentality in the United Kingdom. The Church of England, that ape of the Catholic Church born out of adultery and rebellion, was the first of the Christian organizations to declare contraception permissible. This was done in 1930 at the Lambeth Conference, decades before the abortifacient pill was invented. At that time, the principal means of preventing pregnancy was either abstaining from the marital act or using barriers such as condoms. Rather humorously, the leadership of the Church of England at the time thought that faithful believers would only use contraception in extreme circumstances, that the norm would remain families with many children. That's pretty silly considering, and it shows that they have forgotten that sin and concupiscence exist. By the 1960s, the use of contraceptives was widespread, and then the pill hit the market. It had the effect on the family of a nuclear bomb going off. Not coincidentally, that was the time that the UK began importing people from very different and far-off cultures into the country, leading to some early observers noting how destructive this would be for the UK in the future. One such figure has become a villain in the minds of the progressives running the UK at present, Enoch Powell, who in 1968 gave his famous, or perhaps infamous, Rivers of Blood speech that predicted violence being the result of the kind of importation of peoples we see in the UK today. Now, to be clear, I'm not making some kind of screed against immigration. Immigration is a complex topic. It's important to understand how the UK got to the bizarre place where it denies legitimate Christian refugees from Syria, despite its history as being a country that used its Christian heritage as a motivation to right international wrongs. See the UK's leading role in abolishing the slave trade in the 19th century for one such example, and the example of the leadership of Wilberforce on this. But ask yourself this question: which group of people consistently speaks against contraception today? Christians, especially Catholics. Do you think that has anything to do with Christian refugees not being permitted into their country on the laughable grounds that Christianity isn't a religion of peace, while simultaneously importing staggering numbers of adherents to the unironically named religion of peace? Some of us call the UK the English Caliphate. It's not far off from becoming that way. If you're wondering what a chastisement looks like, that's one way it can manifest. Simply look to the Old Testament for similar stories of the Hebrews being chastised by God for their infidelity with foreigners as the instrument. The Old Testament is filled with these stories. Thank you for listening and for your support. If you want to support my work, there are options in the description of this video. I ask that people continue to pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the church. I'm Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.